All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another excellent episode of the Because Football podcast. This is your host, Coach Andrew, and I have a fellow Andrew today as our guest. Andrew Olsson of Pan Africa Football is an online website related to all things African football. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Andrew. Thanks for having me on.
For sure. So I think, the first thing would be, how did you kind of develop this initial interest in African football? Like what kind of piqued your interest and led you to obviously eventually starting this news site and covering, the continent's football scene?
Well, when I was in school, I was always kind of into history, a bit of a history nerd. And I was always kind of the person who'd read ahead in the textbook, things like that. But I found that we learn very little in the United States about Africa. So I kind of took it on my own initiative to learn more about the continent, all the different countries and peoples there. And in terms of how I tied it into football, I was bitten by the football bug around the 1998 World Cup. I began following Major League Soccer here, but I was always interested by the national team competitions. And I began watching the Africa Cup of Nations. And I found that just kind of, you see a lot of African culture embodied in this football there. And so I just kind of married my two interests, I would say. And in terms of how I came about to develop the website, this came around 4 or 5 years ago. I was taking an online course in scouting and management with an online school. And a couple of agents taught the class, and I did a project focusing on the transfer market and where African players move to Europe, the pathways that they did. And I found, it really drew the interest of these agents. And I just, I found talking to them that there's a lot of interest in African football, but little is known about it by the football industry. So I decided to take on this project, immerse myself in African football, the competitions that go on there, and write about it. And that's how I got my start, really. And then I went on to LinkedIn, things like that, and just kind of reached out to people, journalists in Africa, people who own clubs, youth academies, players as well. And over time, I just built up a network there and continued to write and kind of cover the domestic leagues and, the CAF Champions League, the national team competitions. And so, that's how it kind of got started. And it's really built into something interesting. And that's what I'm hoping to continue to do continue with this project and just continue to build my network and, just build an opportunity in the football industry.
Yeah. I love your story for a couple of reasons. I mean, I think that we share a passion for the game, obviously, and just similarly being a history nerd or always interested in various cultures and things. And yeah, like the soccer just ties in so well. Being a global game, you're just able to connect with people all over the world, and that's really a lot of that interest was part of like the impetus behind starting this podcast for me to connect with people. So I love that we kind of share that. I feel like I could go a couple ways after your response there, but I feel like, my first question would be, coming back to your original project and, of studying transfer flows between things, like why is there such a lack of information, or why does, let's say the big football, mostly, Eurocentric, so European based clubs, why do you think there is such a lack of information about African football, given that it's proven over time, we're a couple of generations in now of African players showing their ability and doing it on a world stage?
Well, that's an excellent question. I think one of the big reasons when you look at sub-Saharan Africa, excluding North Africa in this case, there's a real lack of data. It's something where there aren't too many websites or sort of media sources that really focus on sub-Saharan African football, particularly the domestic leagues. This information is often found on Facebook accounts. There's a lot of enterprising African journalists who do cover these leagues closely. But, that isn't something that can catch the attention of, the big media companies around the world who cover who focus on European football, the club football. And so, when it comes to the transfer market, you look at a popular website is Transfer Market, of course. They know very little about these players. The values that they put on players are kind of random. They just kind of slap a random value on a player based on the limited information they have. And so that's kind of prevented, I believe, more of a flow of African players moving to Europe. They have to prove themselves in smaller leagues and North African leagues, because I think, this lack of information, it really just kind of impacts how clubs view these players when they try to evaluate players. They have little video. There's a lot less video available of these players. And, there's some issues in African football that have come up that have kind of deterred European clubs. Sometimes, just this general lack of information makes the bigger clubs in the world, in the United States and Europe, a little hesitant to take that dive into African football. It feels like kind of a high risk, maybe low reward. So yeah, that's how I would describe it, and the reason for that.
Okay. And then so since you started at that point, on this journey, you yourself have been part of creating this information, and creating more data, and telling more of a story around African football, where maybe it's not always accessible, especially to like an American audience. So throughout this project, and throughout building Pan Africa football, like, who are some of those connections or those people you mentioned, the networks you built? Like, what type of people are helping you develop this? Because you're obviously doing 99% of this remotely, right, from the US. So it's not like you have your own firsthand accounts. So I'm curious, what type of people are assisting you and supporting this venture?
Well, like I mentioned, I went on LinkedIn and just tried to reach out to a lot of people, and you meet a lot of, it varies the type of people that you meet. There's people who are looking to, maybe advance their cause. But, in Africa, a lot of people are very kind. They're willing to share information. I meet people who have connections to clubs over there. For example, I met somebody in Burkina Faso who, if I want to speak to a player there, speak to a club or something like that, he can connect me to those sources. A lot of it for me was finding websites. There isn't a whole lot of good coverage of African football in English, but if you can find websites in Arabic, French, some of the languages that are spoken in Africa, it illuminates a lot. And thank goodness we have translators on web browsers, on Facebook,
Exactly.
and things like that. That's really been a huge boost to my cause. But if you are willing to reach out and try to network with people, and you can kind of filter through maybe people who claim to have information. People are eager to prove to you that they do have connections over there and they can help provide information. So I think that's a real big part of it, is just networking and finding people, finding reliable sources. And that's something I've become very good at. I'm good with people. I'm kind of good with, realizing maybe what's real and what's not so real. And over time, I've become really good at that, identifying, hey, this is somebody who can give me some credible information, who can tell me more about, clubs and players that you can't find on Wikipedia or something like that on sources that you find on the internet. And so that's really been kind of a point of pride for me, is being able to meet these people. I know a lot about African culture and the different groups of people there, which is why a lot of people over there respect me and are eager to speak to me. Whereas, the football industry is, it's a capitalistic sort of thing. They're looking to find players, make money off the players. I'm just there for information and to kind of learn more and, maybe hopefully create some opportunities for people over there.
Yeah. Yeah. And certainly having done your research and learning, and really caring about the different countries, the cultures. I mean, you talk about, decades, millennia, centuries of various cultural movements, and like you said, all of the diverse languages within the continent too. Another thing I like about your story, and kind of like what you've done here, is one that it kind of just grew out of a passion and an interest, but also the fact that like you didn't kind of wait around to like get permission, so to speak. You didn't apply, you didn't write some articles and apply to all these other bigger, maybe like your ESPN FCs and your goal.com and like a lot of those bigger publications. You kind of just went and like did it on your own, right? So to someone who might have a similar interest, but they're like, hey, I don't really have the credentials, I don't have the qualifications, I just kind of need to bootstrap this and get it forward. Like, what advice would you give to somebody who wants to start some type of, media outlet, or really just strike out on any kind of venture and bet on themselves?
That's an excellent term you put. Bet on yourself. That's something that's a valuable trait to learn, is to develop confidence in yourself. I in the United States, sometimes it's difficult to discuss football with people because, it's such a niche sport over here. It's growing.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the interest is growing a lot.
Right.
But, my passion, I knew that when I reached out to Africa, I was going to find people who, I believe I'm passionate about football, but there's people over there who are more passionate about it than me. And that's what I knew heading into this, is that if I reached out, there's a good chance there's some part inside me who said, maybe people will go, why are you writing about African football? You're not African. Who are you? Something like that. But I found the reaction in Africa is the complete opposite. People are very welcoming. They think it's fascinating that somebody from the United States is interested in their football. And, the toughest times for me were the early days. When you create a website and you look at the statistics, I'm sure when you started your podcast and you see how many people have watched it.
Oh yeah, I'm there every day. I'm still there.
How many people have visited, the early
Low
days.
numbers, single digits.
I got 3 views, that first month or two when I did this website and was putting up content, waking up at 3 or 4 in the morning, working until 4 or 5 in the evening, afternoon. It's tough, and you just wonder, is this worth my time or something like that? But eventually I kept on kind of writing original content. And one article in particular in the early days, I wrote about, one of my earliest memories of following African football, which was the 2012 Africa Cup of Nations. Zambia won it. It was a historic victory, an incredible story behind it. I won't go into it. There's a lot into it, but I wrote about that and I recapped the entire story, why it was such a historic achievement. And I had met some Zambians, through LinkedIn, including a prominent journalist named Pangalawewe. And when I put this out on my LinkedIn, he commented, he said, this is a great article. And then all of a sudden, all these Zambians, I think because he, wrote about it and he had a big network, they liked it. They started liking it. I sent a bunch of connection requests out to them and things like that. And I saw, wow, I got a few hundred views on this article as compared to the single.
You made it. Yeah.
Early days.
Exactly.
Like, wow, there might be something here. A moment like that is so exhilarating when you're kind of grinding hard and not feeling like you're not getting a reward for it. And after that, those days, of course, where there's little views do come, they continue to come. But that really gave me kind of that extra push to keep going with this, that maybe this could lead to something. And then eventually, through that, once you get some maybe prominent people who happen upon your content, that creates a big boost, and that can introduce you to people who might say, hey, maybe you're a good writer. You clearly have a knowledge about this, and it can create opportunities for you. And you don't need to get 5,000 views or 10,000 likes. It's only maybe that one influential person who likes it and, feels an urge to reach out to you to learn more about you. And that's really kind of, a moment like that really kind of made this feel like it was worth grinding hard for. And that's what I would say. There's going to be, the earliest days are the toughest. But if you keep on working, if you keep, working day to day and people happen upon your website or your work, whatever you do, or podcast, and they see that you're putting in that work every day, that's a trait in itself that people will admire. And,
For sure.
you never know, that can be the impetus for somebody to reach out to you who could maybe advance your cause or boost your career. So that's
Yeah.
what I would say, is just keep grinding through those early days. Your opportunity might come, it might not come, but you will learn from the experience, and you'll learn a lot about yourself through that.
Yeah. Love it. Love it. Yeah. I'm ready to end this meeting and go put some work in. Just got me pumped up from that. Cause yeah, I totally feel that, like, being a very, you'll probably be in the 23, 24 range, of podcasts I've done so far. And that's really nothing in the grand scheme, of things. So it's like, and I'm not necessarily as worried about the views per se, but just like you said, of the ability to connect with people, to make some of those contacts with just the right person, right? And really, just at the end of the day, because it's like a win-win. It's like, all right, we keep doing this, we keep grinding. Uh, we just like it. We just like doing it, even though it is hard, right? It's something we're passionate about. So why not do something constructive with it that could lead to something greater? And then, all right, when we do, or if we do get some kind of buzz and notoriety, and it leads to other opportunities, great, then even better, So yeah, I echo that, and I appreciate, I respect the time and work you put in. Like, looking again at the site, I know you guys are revamping it, but just the amount of content you're able to push out is really impressive. But let's kind of switch from your journey now to the subject matter, right, of African football. We've got the African Cup of Nations starting in just a few days, hosted in the Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, where I'll be traveling myself. And for the average person, they might know some of the big guns of African football. We know Morocco just went so far and performed so well, the best any African team ever has at the previous World Cup. We know that Senegal has been really strong. They had a solid World Cup as well, getting out of their group. They are the returning defending champions, rather, of AFCON. We know about Egypt has such a long history. I believe they hold the record for AFCON titles held currently. Ivory Coast had its generation about 10 years or so ago. South Africa has its time. Then we look at the other Anglophone West African countries of your Nigeria's and Ghana as well. Not to mention some of the other, like Algeria's has their group now. They have Riyad Mahrez. So a lot of talent, of course. But what would you say, outside of the top teams, like, what are some of the stories, the teams, the players to watch out for in this upcoming AFCON?
Well, it's amazing, since I've started following this competition, it's become more and more competitive. There's various reasons for that. You're seeing a lot more dual national players play. That's helped some of the smaller nations, kind of really boost their cause and, have the ability to compete with the big powers that you listed very well. I think there's some real interesting nations. You look at, I mentioned Zambia. I followed Zambian football for a while. I think their national team is poised to perform well at this competition. I mentioned Burkina Faso as well. They're a country that doesn't rely on dual nationals as much as a country like Algeria, Cote d'Ivoire. They've produced a lot of good players in their domestic football, and I think I think they're poised to make a real good run at this competition. The French West African countries are really fascinating to follow. I think Guinea is a team that can really do some things. The Gambia is a country on their AFCON debut in 2021 or 2022. They reached the quarterfinals. They are a great story of a country that's really risen its domestic football and really produced some players who go to Europe now. I've spoken to a couple agents, people in the football industry over in the Gambia. There's all these smaller nations that are really making excellent progress. And I think it's become more and more competitive. I think we're going to see a couple of real surprises. But, like in the World Cup, in the end, you see some surprises, but, Germany ends up winning it, or France or England, one of the big powers. That's probably going to be similar here, but I think we're going to see a couple of really interesting nations that people may have little or no familiarity with reaching the final stages, the quarterfinals, maybe even the semifinals. So yeah, I'd look out for the countries I mentioned. And some of these countries play some really entertaining styles of football. So I'm really excited to see which of these countries, which of the smaller countries can make an impact and draw more attention from the football
Yeah,
industry, because this is when the
yeah,
football industry tunes in.
exactly, exactly. Yeah, yeah, and of course, and I didn't even mention, Cameroon as well. I missed from my list. We know the big ones, but yeah, certainly looking out for Gambia, Guinea. Some of those to pull some surprises. Are you going to fancy a prediction for who you think will lift the cup at the midpoint of February?
I think I'm going to go with Cote d'Ivoire. I think the
Going with
hosts
the hosts. Okay.
have their midfield is incredible. They have Franck Kessié,
Yeah.
Ibrahim Sangare, who plays for Nottingham Forest, and
Yeah.
then Seko Fofana, who
Yeah.
a few
Fofana's a
years
beast.
ago,
Yeah.
yeah, he won the best African player in France's Ligue 1. I really like Cote d'Ivoire there, and they have so much young talent at the forward position. I think they're going to respond well to the pressure of being the host. But like you mentioned, the North African nations always perform well. They always meet a certain standard. Egypt is really good. They have a strong defense, and then when you have a strong defense in Mohamed Salah, a lot of
Yeah.
things are possible. And
Yeah.
then Algeria as well, and of course Morocco, like you mentioned.
Yeah, for sure. And it's with a lot of the countries that are traditionally good. Obviously, there are a lot of factors that go into that country size sometimes, or particular history or cultural influences that lead to that. And then I think sometimes what you see in these bigger tournaments is just like almost like an expectation or a belief from the countries, like they just get it done somehow. Like it's like I don't know if it's quite one of the things that the soccer gods are willing it, but it's just that like those countries, it's kind of like something ingrained, almost subconscious, where they just grow with that ability. And of course there are going to be upsets as well, but they just generally tend to get it done, right, to tend to perform in those key moments. Away from Africa, AFCON, I wanted to talk a little bit about like something that is reared its head again in Europe, which is kind of the resurfacing of the idea of a super league, right? And we've seen that, and that came out a few years ago. Now there's been murmurs of it again, and it seems like there's kind of a prototype happening for that within Africa, as a partnership with FIFA and CAF and an African Super League. Yet it also operates alongside the CAF, for the African Champions League as well. So could you just share a little bit for some people, like maybe what's been going on with that, as it is something that could definitely have ramifications for the rest of global football in the coming years.
Well, you touched upon a very hot topic, Andrew. The UEFA Super League, obviously, there's been a lot of discussion around that. And yeah, like you mentioned, there's currently a movement amongst in the African football leadership to start a similar thing, a similar concept, which they toyed with a couple months ago with a competition called the African Football League, which featured 8 teams. They're looking to expand upon that. And it's a competition that looks to bring in the most well-known clubs in Africa. With the UEFA Super League, the difference between that and what's going on in Africa is the UEFA Super League or the UEFA Champions League, pardon me, makes a ton of money. And there's a lot of clubs. There's the leadership of UEFA, all the television rights. There's a whole lot of money being made with the UEFA Champions League, and why there's so much opposition and popular opposition from fans, supporters, the media, is because there's a lot of people who already do very well from the current situation. UEFA does very well, and that's why they don't want these big clubs like Real Madrid to start up a super league, because they're enjoying the situation as it is, and we all see there's plenty of money in the Champions League. Now, when it comes to Africa, it's an entirely different case. The Champions League, the CAF Champions League, is a competition where clubs really struggle to make a good profit from it. It doesn't even approach the profits that clubs, you see it all the time in the UEFA Champions League. Maybe a club from a less known country makes it into the group stage. they make a huge amount of money,
Yeah,
more money than
yeah,
they could ever imagine from that, just participating in that group stage. In Africa, it's not the case. There's so many travel expenses,
yeah.
accommodation expenses that come into it. And a reason why the movement for the Super League and CAF, a similar sort of competition, is coming is because the biggest clubs in Africa, primarily North Africa, you look at Morocco, Egypt, Tunisia, some of the biggest clubs there, as well as in South Africa and Tanzania. They're not making a whole lot of money from participating in the CAF Champions League or its equivalent to the Europa League, the CAF
Mm.
Confederation Cup. And so this has been a real movement that they've pushed for as the most influential forces in African football. And CAF is now looking into a sort of Super League concept in order to increase the prize money, to make it more worthwhile for these clubs to put their resources and energy into making teams and succeeding
Gotcha.
on the continental stage. Now, what's complicated about it in the case of Africa is at first I was like, yeah, this would be great. This would be huge to boost the profile of African football, particularly the clubs on the continent. But
Hmm.
I'm a bit conflicted. The more I think about it, the more that a competition like this would take away from the domestic leagues. And domestic leagues in Africa they're always struggling for sponsorship, television rights. The question at the beginning of these domestic league seasons is always, where's the money going to come from? And I feel like, like in the case when you heard about kind of the fears of a UEFA Super League, this would be even more pronounced in Africa, where these North African clubs who do have a lot of money, spend
Hmm.
millions of dollars, they would be getting enriched while the smaller clubs, and you look at the domestic leagues of Ghana, Nigeria, clubs like that, it'll be more difficult for them to make an impact and to get to that status where they can make some major profits that they can reinvest in their academies and producing players. So I was speaking with a journalist in Ethiopia about it. And, he kind of expressed a similar fear. There's kind of a whole lot of questions that get raised from this proposition by CAF. They want to give $1 million to each African federation. And, my friend was telling me from Ethiopia, he's never heard of a case where federations are giving money to the clubs in their country. So
Right.
there's just so many complications and questions of how this additional prize money will be redistributed. CAF has partnered with the Saudi Arabian Football Federation in an attempt to kind of build this sponsorship. But I do kind of see how there's similar fears to the UEFA Super League, where the rich will get richer and the poor will get poorer because of this. So that's how I
Yeah.
would sum it up.
Yeah, and you make an interesting point where the domestic leagues are already struggling for that attention and for that investment from sponsors. And now, if you bring in something that's even a premier product that is going to gain even more eyes, not that it's a zero sum game, but certainly there's going to be more focus and attention and investment in that case going to the top. And something that you and I have talked about and you've kind of seen through studying the game in Africa is already it's even country to country and within countries is like the resources, right? So for us growing up in the United States, like even to not play at a high level, even just with your local club, local township, even a recreational level, we're used to these resources, we're used to organization, a certain pathway, and it's just certainly a different picture that is a challenge, in Africa. So could you share a little bit about what you've learned of, like at the youth level, at lower amateur levels, like what are those development pathways and things look like before we get to the top, even within, a domestic level?
Well, I think there's a lot of very good notable examples of youth academies in Africa that are succeeding. Sadio Mane, Senegal. A lot of the members that you'll see on the Senegal team, they graduated from Generation Foot, which some of these top academies they've succeeded because of networking. They built relationships with European clubs. In the case of
Hmm.
Generation Foot, it's with FC Metz in France.
Right.
They said, hey, you can have first priority on the players we develop, but we need you to invest some money and facilities for our academy, so that we can continue to develop these players and become, the top destination. But throughout Africa and the smaller countries, you look at countries like Kenya, like I mentioned, Ethiopia, East Africa, some of the lesser known countries. What I've learned is that, there's a whole lot that comes into building academies and providing the resources for these academies. What's more important than the players than the training, the coaches you hire, is sponsorship. Finding opportunities where you can get a little bit of an influx of money to create these opportunities for players. And so that's something where I've really learned, transitioning from a fan of football to becoming, sort of a journalist to somebody who wants to be involved, is you learn more and more about the complications and how much it takes just for a player to get into the public eye, so to say, to graduate from being a youth player that nobody knows to becoming somebody who's the subject of discussion for a transfer or something like that. So I would say that, the most important thing that I've seen with the most successful African youth academies that have become well known is networking and building partnerships to find that sponsorship that they need. And then, once you do that, you can produce the players, you get a percentage of future transfer fees, things of that nature. And then it kind of compounds, to where the money starts to come in. But to get to that point, you really have to have a good program, a solid program, a well-planned program, which is something I didn't really understand as a supporter of football, but which I've become more familiar with. It's such a struggle to get balls, to get cleats in Africa and things like that, just to get to equipment. And, as well as things like nutrition, having the right diet, you find becomes such an important thing for youth players, and something that's a lot more difficult to accomplish in Africa because, of course, resources, things like that. So, that's why European academies, American academies have such an edge on Africa, is that, things as fundamental as the diet and the food you're eating, at that age, growth, you're growing the most, your bones are developing, things like that. And the reason why it's more easier for American players, European players, South American players, perhaps, is just these fundamentals that we all tend to take for granted over here. That's difficult to accomplish in Africa. There's a lot of fundamental things that go beyond the football pitch that are important in the development of a young player. And that's something that I've come to learn just by speaking with people who own academies or running academies over there who are trying to build a name for themselves.
Yeah. I was just reading, just got the book. It's Feet of the Chameleon. I think it's David Hawkey. I think it's the story of African football. Is a book by a journalist, and he was interviewing a coach. I'm going to forget the country, but the coach, and this was for like the youth national team setup, and rather than using actual cones for their training, he used like these like plastic containers that you could get like candy in or something. And he's like, if I save the money on the equipment, then like we can eat better, right? We can buy better quality food, and obviously to be a top athlete, you need that nutrition, you need that diet. So those are definitely some challenges, that aspiring players at the grassroots level certainly face at different extents, right? We don't want to use a blanket term with such a massive continent, but certainly, country to country or even region to region, it can be different. What would you say is something that, from your initial interest in African football and doing that study on transfer flows, like what are a couple of the things that you've learned, that made you fall even more in love with African football as we've gone along?
What was interesting is when I was following the Africa Cup of Nations, I would always look at the squads for each team. And in the smaller countries, you just see such a variety of player pathways that these players take, because in the football industry, the World Cup is used as a barometer to say, hey, let's look deeper at that country. So Nigeria, Ghana, Egypt, some
Hmm.
of the countries in Africa, Senegal, of course, they've had success in the World Cup. So then the football industry says, well, hey, let's investigate this country deeper. But when you look at a country like maybe Zambia, Burkina Faso, you'll see players who play in their professional football in countries like India, Moldova, Hungary, countries like that, which, the leagues we hardly know about, but, these are leagues that pay a lot better than their leagues back in Africa. So from these countries, African players have had to form unique pathways, to make a living, to gain more attention.
Right.
I've seen players from Liberia, some of the smaller countries like that. They'll go to Southeast Asia or something like that. I met a Nigerian agent who worked in Uzbekistan who would bring players from the Nigerian league over there. And it doesn't sound like much, but it's a bigger spotlight than playing in Nigeria, where there's just kind of so many players, and most of the players who go to Europe from there come from academies rather than the league there.
Hmm.
So that's what I ended up studying. It's just why are these players playing in India or Uzbekistan or Southeast Asia, Malaysia or Thailand or places like that. And I've met agents as well, African agents who are or agents who have African clients. They really have to. They don't get accepted by the big clubs or European clubs or even clubs in MLS. So they've had to go to the second division, the U.S., what's now the USL Championship in the United States.
Right.
They have to look at places like Southeast Asia just to get their foot in the door. And then if they can succeed there and that player can maybe move on to a bigger league, that's credibility for them,
Right.
for the agents who are pushing to promote their African clients for these countries. So I'm so glad that there's more attention on like the Africa Cup of Nations and that there's more players from the smaller countries that don't qualify for the World Cup. They're building pathways to even countries like France to maybe play in the second division there. So that was
Hmm.
my thing, is just looking at these pathways, is identifying which countries are more open to bringing in African players and taking a chance on African players. Of course, the big five leagues in Europe aren't going to, but maybe Israel, maybe Turkey, maybe Greece, countries like that where, maybe they can help their clubs qualify for UEFA competition. And then they'll
Right.
do well in the Europa League, the Conference League, the Champions League. And then, that'll make the big clubs kind of go, maybe there's something going on in these countries. And it's just been fascinating in my work seeing the growth of this. It's so rapid at the moment, but there's still so far to go. But
Sure.
there's some major strides being made in these, and the pathways are becoming more clear and more advantageous to the African player.
Yeah, I always find that really fascinating too. Like, I'd spent time living in Thailand. I traveled a lot through Cambodia, through Vietnam. I remember being in a hostel in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, and a regular Friday night party at the hostel. And there's like, it's pretty, to see an African person in Asia. It's you stand out, right? Like
Yeah.
similar to like a white guy walking around. It's like, okay, this is something that's different. Like, what's going on here? So got talking. I forget exactly where he was from. It was either Ghana or Nigeria, but he'd been in Cambodia for like 3 years playing professional football, and that's how he got his opportunity. He's making a living, maybe able to send some back home. But I think certainly a lot of it is like the networks, like you talked about, the connections, the agents. Maybe there was a guy who played in the case of your Nigerian agent in Uzbekistan, had played there maybe or knew someone who did. But I think also, to what extent is it like actual government regulations, right? Because we know, like with England, for example, it's really difficult to bring a player to England to get a work permit, right? And then the EU versus non-EU countries. So, like, what have you kind of learned about some of those regulations, restrictions, and like how that can impact the movement of talent, up north to Europe?
Yeah, I'd say, think about who these African countries are competing with when it comes to clubs who want foreign players. South America, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Colombia have such a great reputation that for a long time, so many clubs in the United States and Europe, they say, well, clearly there's some good players in Africa, but I'd rather take a chance on this Brazilian player, this Argentinian player, Uruguayan player. That's what I'd say, is that these different continents where players are seeking better opportunities abroad, they have to compete against each other, so to say. So that's kind of what prevented, I'd say the rise of African players for a while, is that there's just more faith in a player. You look at Major League Soccer, they see a good player in the Copa Libertadores, the South American Champions League, who's 21. They're going to take a chance on that guy before they take a chance on an African player. That's the tradition. And then you mentioned England. England's a great example. No African player could play in England, could transfer directly to English football because of the work permit regulations, which have just changed. They just changed, I think, for this season, maybe last season, where now they have sort of a point system where African players can qualify now to get a work permit in England, but that just changed. Back before then, you had to have a parent who was from England, so you could have a dual passport, dual nationality. So that's been a real obstacle, I would say, for African players, but it's getting better because, people would be shocked what African players make playing in their domestic leagues. It's not very good. They're so eager to make to have these opportunities abroad. So I think that's kind of something that appeals to clubs, is this buy low, sell high philosophy, where, particularly smaller clubs in Europe and the United States who don't want to spend big transfer fees, which is the case when you go to South America often. And why Africa is really appealing is because you can find that player, you can buy him for peanuts, for pennies, and then you can develop him and then sell them for millions, which is something that's massive for these smaller European clubs who want to build their reputation. But in general, I'd say it's just that tradition of, hey, Brazil and Argentina, these countries have done great. So they have the best youth players, the best youth infrastructure, and we're going to just focus on there. But it's getting better. And, stories like I mentioned with Senegal and Generation Foot, academies like that are building a real reputation that's making countries, European countries, clubs in European countries want to build a network in Africa and to build partnerships which mutually benefit both parties. And I think we're going to see more of that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's almost like it's just, within the market, it's like a brand thing, right? Like the Brazilian, the Argentinian, like they have a great brand with it. You can find a Brazilian playing in probably every league in the world. Part of that is they just do produce so many players, but it's also a brand thing. Or you think Brazil, you think, all right, they've got to be good. Yeah. Whereas if it's even another South American country, the brand changes a little bit, that pull, that status. And then, we talk about Africa. So even beyond the actual paperwork, regulations, all that, it's an interesting point you make about that brand piece. For people who might not know a lot about like domestic football with Africa, we touched a little bit on some of the bigger clubs that would be a part of this African Super League. But what are some of the, and we know the national teams who have been strong, but what are some of the strongest like domestic leagues within Africa who consistently do well in the CAF Champions League, who are producing players, in the case of Generation Foot, like I think, they're more of an academy and they might perform at a domestic level, but I don't know if they're really performing on a continental level within Africa. So what are some of those stronger domestic leagues that you'd like to tell our audience about?
Well, I think one that really stands out to me that people wouldn't know about is Tanzania in East Africa. They have a couple clubs in Dar es Salaam, Simba Sporting Club, and then Young Africans is another club. They're big rivals in Dar es Salaam. They have quite a sizable budget. They'll have a budget for a season that's around $5 million US, wow, even more. Okay. What they do is they bring in all the players who star in these sub-Saharan domestic African leagues. You look at a league like the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's a domestic league where there's a lot of stoppages because of travel difficulties, financial difficulties, but the country produces some incredible players who go on to Tanzania, some of the South Africa, perhaps, which has a good league. And then, of course, North Africa as well. So I'd say Tanzania. Tanzania is going to be in the Africa Cup of Nations, but I don't expect them to progress from the group stage. And there's some reasons for that we don't have time to get into. But their league does very well. The reason, Generation Foot, they do compete in the Senegalese Premier Division.
Okay.
But the reason why sometimes clubs from these countries don't make as much of an impact in the continental competitions is because there's so much player movement. A player does well for one season, and then the bigger clubs come in. They
Exactly.
swoop in, and then these clubs can't really, they have to kind of improvise in the preseason, find signings. They don't have that chemistry. So then it carries over into the early stages of the continental competitions. But I'd say Tanzania, I'd say Democratic Republic of the Congo has some good clubs that produce good players. I enjoy following the Zambian League, the Zambian Super League. Ethiopia has a league where a lot of people are very passionate about it, and they have some good players. Senegal is coming along, but like I mentioned, there's always clubs swooping in for their players. And then North Africa, there's a lot of money in the North African leagues. Egypt, some of these clubs, they spend up to €1 million on transfers, and Morocco as well. But yeah, I would say, what you see is kind of similar to a situation in Scotland. In a lot of sub-Saharan African leagues, you have Celtic and Rangers. You have a couple big clubs.
Yeah, two big teams and then a big gap. Yeah,
exactly.
Big distance between.
Yeah. So, but you look at a league like Tanzania, there's a surprisingly large amount of money at these clubs. And that's how I'd sum it up. But yeah, like I mentioned, there's a lot of, in most sub-Saharan African countries, there's one or two big clubs that are the traditional giants. And then that's kind of where you can kind of look deeper and know that they have good youth academies and they produce players who move on to bigger and better things. Okay.
And so you started your Pan Africa football site and news page. You have the Facebook as well that you're very active on. It's been a couple years now since that started. So in that period of time, like, where have you seen the biggest growth, the biggest improvements within, whether it's African football as a whole, or are there some particular individual nations that have made great progress? Like, what would you say has really stuck out within that time that you've been following?
I would say one nation that's just been on the rise, continues to be, is Senegal. Senegal dominated all the national team competitions in Africa last season, or the last couple of years, the youth, U20, U17, because their youth development is so strong. It's just only gotten better and better. The league there, the clubs, like I mentioned, the clubs don't really perform great on the big stage because there's constant movement of players, but I've been fascinated by how Senegal just continues to get the job done, even though, maybe the resources are pretty limited compared to North Africa. Just the youth development there is fantastic. I think there's getting to the point, we've seen in the United States how MLS has improved its youth development so much because there's a lot more graduates of the academies. They're playing at younger ages so that by the time they're 19 or 20, they already have a good amount of professional experience, and then the European clubs swoop in. That's something you don't see quite as much in Africa. Not enough really young players are getting that professional exposure in general. But I think there's some strides being made in the domestic leagues. You look at Nigeria. Nigeria was a league that was known for having a lot of corruption. The home team would always win in the Nigerian Premier League for various reasons. But I think after COVID, I think for some countries, COVID kind of presented an opportunity to kind of restart and refocus. And some of these countries are doing well to rebuild the faith of supporters in the country. Whereas in the past, in a country like Nigeria, so many Nigerians abandoned their domestic league and just focused on the English Premier League. Their favorite, their Arsenal, their Chelsea.
Exactly.
And it's getting better. There's still a long way to go, but that's something I've been impressed with. Is I think COVID, while it was awful around the world, I think it created an opportunity for some of these sub-Saharan African countries to find their priorities, fix some of their issues in their domestic leagues. And I think there will be some more positive growth, but we will see. But that's what I've been impressed with the most, is just having followed these domestic leagues, is that there has been some notable improvement. And most importantly, I get engagement on my page because, I promote these leagues. And I think, I see some of the comments from Africans, Nigerians, Ghanaians, who are kind of saying, wow, this is great. Maybe I'll go to the matches over there more rather than just stay at home and watch Arsenal.
Right.
I'd say the English Premier League is still the biggest opponent to these domestic leagues because of the attention they take. But I think there's some strides being made, but it's just a matter of keeping on that focus. And I think that's really something to focus on. And why I enjoy what I do with Pan-Africa football is just highlighting the good stories and trying to identify the clubs who are doing good things and producing good players, and maybe the people who are making positive change there.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's so one thing with football being such a global game, like you can really look anywhere and find something intriguing and really to draw you in, whether that's just the quality of the play, the history of the clubs, the teams, any stories, any type of growth and improvement, and big wins and upsets from the underdog. So yeah, I think it's great work that you're doing. I think, obviously I respect and appreciate your personal journey of deciding to start Pan Africa football and pushing that forward. I wish you the best, going forward. Hopefully it can become and blossom into something bigger for you within the football industry, and just continue to highlight, all of the football going on within the continent. But it's been a great episode. I think there's a lot for not only someone totally new to African football to get to wrap their head around, but also maybe someone a little bit more experience and in touch to still kind of see things a little different way, which I appreciate. And we'd like to wrap up this episode, Andrew, the way we do each episode. And that's, could you please complete the sentence, because football, ...
Because football, I can meet people around the world and, share my love of the sport that maybe I can't in the United States. So because football, I meet new people and I engage with new cultures, and that's why I love it.
Awesome. Very, very similar. We're birds of a feather here. Not only same name, but very similar interests. So thank you so much, Andrew. We're going to put your LinkedIn info. We'll have the link to the site, which you're expecting a new, the site's going to go live. Did you say tomorrow? So everybody watching this, it's going to be live. So go to it, panafricafootball.com. You've also very busy on the Facebook branch of that as well. So we'll put all those links in, and please reach out to Andrew, for any more information or to get involved. And thank you all again, everyone who checked in, for watching, for listening. We appreciate your support. Please, if you're catching us on YouTube or Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you find us, please give us a like, leave a comment, leave some of your thoughts, and subscribe so you can see more fantastic guests like Andrew. But thank you all so much, and we'll see you on the next one.